From a technical perspective, obviously there are two ways to do detection, right? It's either on device, what we call it on the edge, on device, or on the cloud. So we run analytics on the cloud right now, and there's sufficient cost involved on an ongoing basis, but we didn't have a choice. To run it on the camera, it requires a purpose-built hardware with high computing power, processors, and that itself is very costly. So we'd rather choose a lower upfront cost that is a little bit more palatable, even though it means a higher ongoing cloud cost for us and for its users. So that is the current approach that we're looking at right now. Ideally, we can reduce both costs and give you the same kind of output in that sense, but as of now, there are technical constraints, meaning I can't have the best of both worlds. So I'd rather choose lower upfront with a monthly fees that will be a bit more palatable for most users rather than a few $100s for one camera just to monitor an elderly.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today I am in conversation with Ivan Mun. Ivan is the founder and CEO of Ello, and we're going to hear all about Ello and his journey as to how he got to Ello and what Ello is all about. So thank you so much for joining me today, Ivan.
And for inviting me, Payal. I look forward to sharing my journey.
Great. Yeah, I look forward to hearing your journey as well. So, Ivan, let's start with, of course, the very, very fundamental question as to what exactly was this personal journey that led you into caregiving tech?
I started working with my dad's company since I graduated from Nayar Polytechnic and serving my NS. So for almost a good 20 years, I've been
So all
into,
those who are not familiar with NS, because this is a global
yeah,
podcast, it's just for their information, it's national service, which all Singaporeans, the men have to do for a period of 24 months. It's like a military service. Okay, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Do go ahead. Yeah.
thanks for helping me to clarify that. So yeah, so for almost 20 years, I've been in the electronics industry and it shaped my interest in consumer electronics and technology. So how Ello started really was as a home security product. That's where we wanted to position ourselves. But as we built it, we realized that we'll just be another camera company, and I probably can't survive that fight with all the big boys in the market. Then one day, I had a friend called Greg. So Greg is from the US. He asked me a simple question: why not build this for caregivers? And then that simple question actually opened a wound that has been with me ever since, which is about my aunt. So the story goes where a couple of years back, my aunt was hospitalized for almost a month and she finally got discharged. So I wasn't available that morning, so my brother was the one who helped pick her up and send her back home. And then in the afternoon, my mom called me and she said, "Hey, Ivan, auntie said she's not feeling too good. Can you go visit her?" And I said, "Okay, mom, I'll visit her in the evening before dinner." And at the back of my head is she just got discharged, right? So it couldn't be that bad, number one. Number two, my mom didn't sound urgent at all. And I was like, if she's not urgent, I'll do it later. Then what happened was when evening came, I drove down to my aunt's place. As usual, I would give her a call as I was driving down. My aunt picked up the call. She called out my name and then she dropped the phone. And that was the last time we spoke. I rushed onto her place and I found her slumped on her armchair. Then on, there was actually plenty of guilt, I assure you. There's a lot of what ifs. What if I've done this? What if I've driven faster? What if I didn't delay? So there was a lot of what ifs, and I've been feeling that sense of guilt for quite a while, for a few months actually. And then coupled with this Greg's suggestion on Ello of going towards caregiving, it suddenly dawned upon me that it all clicked together, right? If at that point in time I had a solution that could monitor my aunt, for example, where I could see visually with clarity and perhaps proactively update me on the status, for instance, my decision making would have been very different and the outcome would have been very different. And that led me to Ello, as in Ello to where it is today.
Okay, so I'm sorry to hear about your aunt and thank you for sharing your personal story because I think it's very important. The message there is that, okay, there's no point in you feeling guilty about it because her time had come, unfortunately. But the fact that you then moved on to caregiving tech, I think, is also probably a tribute to her. And the fact that this has led you to expand and give a security system a far deeper meaning and impact.
So
That, I think, is something which you should be really proud of. I understand that before you actually set up Ello Care, you spent a lot of months speaking to different caregivers. So, what is something that you heard from every caregiver that you spoke with on a very repeated basis? What was something that just kept coming back to you?
it's interesting because they keep telling me the same thing in very different ways in their own words in that sense. And it's always, in a nutshell, it's always, I can't step away. What if something happens when I do? And then you realize over time that commitment that they have as a caregiver turns into exhaustion. And
Yeah,
exhaustion is not sustainable for caregiving.
yeah,
And we always hear this, right? You can't pour from an empty cup. So end of the day, the thing that we keep hearing is that I can't get help. I need to do this myself. I don't know where to go. And I have to be always on, always there, always watching. And that's not healthy. As a caregiver, it's not healthy. For the person receiving the care, it's not healthy as well because you can't, like I said, you can't pour from an empty cup. You can't caregive when you're not in a good state yourself.
yeah. Yeah, because the factor here seems to be guilt, right? Of
Right.
am I doing too little? If I'm resting, what if? There's always that what if as a caregiver. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, I think that's something that for a caregiver, I think is a very, how shall I say, not a job, but it's something which is, what's the word? It's
They feel, no, they always feel obligated because they're
obligated.
family,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And they can't, and they don't, maybe they don't know how to, or they feel that they cannot outsource it. And if I'm seen doing that, I'm not being a filial child.
yeah.
So it goes back round and round again. But yeah, that's the message that I've always been hearing from all these conversations I'm getting. Do I agree with it? I understand where they're coming from, but I don't necessarily agree with how they're handling it. I'm sure there are better ways. Yeah.
Yeah. And so is that what, okay, before we talk about the technology and what is unique and different about Hello Care, the system that has been set up, what are the most common emergencies that actually happen at home for the elderly, or not just the elderly, even people who are possibly compromised in terms of their health? What are some of the common emergencies that you have observed within all the people that you've met or since you've actually started the business?
I think one common problem that we always see and hear and talk about is always falls and faints. Okay, so the difference between a fall and a faint, obviously, a fall is when you go from vertical to horizontal and you can get back up in a way. That's a fall. A faint is when you go from vertical to horizontal and you don't move and you just stay there. That's the faint. And actually, both, if you think about it, both are very high risk events. Okay, and if not treated or not attended to quickly, the risk of mortality actually increases significantly. And as you age, unfortunately, what happens is that fall risk actually starts getting higher and higher. Okay, it could be because of vision, that means you don't see clearly and you miss a step, for example. Even the little curb when you come up from the bathroom to let's say to the bedrooms or to the corridors or the living room, that little curb from the bathroom. If you look at it, it's probably what, 5 millimeters, for example. For the young people, it's only 5 millimeters. What's wrong with that? But for the older folks, I've seen videos where friends have shared with me, caregivers have shared with me. A friend's mom literally just tripped over that 5 millimeter curb, and she wasn't even in a rush. If you look at her, she was in the bathroom, she was just walking out normally, and she tripped. And the sad thing was that fall, it wasn't even. I mean, if you look at kids running and they trip, and you sometimes think that, oh, they may break an arm or something like that. If you look at that video that was shared with me, she was just walking slowly out of the bathroom, tripped, she fell, and resulting from that fall, a broken rib, and she was in the hospital again. So to me, fall hazards, trip hazards are actually one of the most significant challenges that elderly face at home. Of course, beyond that, you may have things like forgetfulness, which may result in smoke and fire, for example. You're cooking, you have something on the stove, and you forget to turn it off, for example. That becomes another risk. But that's where Ello also comes in. We also do detect that. So more for, if you ask me, I think the biggest risk so far has always been falls and faints.
Falls and faints. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about Ello care. How does it fundamentally differ from because everyone today has like a surveillance camera at home, right? Or a system.
Mhm.
How does Ello care actually differ from a regular surveillance system?
Your traditional home surveillance cameras notify you on every movement. If you think about it, you walk out from the bathroom, it triggers a notification today. A dog walks across your front yard, it triggers a notification. The Amazon delivery guy drops something off at your porch, it triggers a notification. What happened is that all these over time adds up and it becomes what we call noise. And over time, what happens is that people become immune to the notifications. And we call this notification fatigue. And what is unique with Allo is that we only notify when something is not right. So all those cases I mentioned, so if grandpa was walking from the bedroom to the kitchen, for example, to get a drink, we won't notify the caregiver because the caregiver doesn't need to know.
Yeah.
But if grandpa falls, we immediately send a notification to the caregiver. So in a nutshell, simply put, whenever Allo pushes a notification to the caregiver, it is best to check in immediately. So this is how we differ. We remove all the noise that doesn't matter to the caregiver, for example, and only give them what matters. And for us, what matters is basically we mention falls and faints, we track for smoke and fire, and for some of the elderly who have, for example, Alzheimer's or dementia, and they end up wandering or another term is eloping from the home, for example, getting out and they don't return back, for instance, we will trigger notifications. And then what we also do is that we use AI to analyze behaviors and routines, right? So for example, today, grandma hasn't left the bedroom since 9 this morning, and it's already 9:30. We don't know what happened because we don't encourage cameras in the bedroom for privacy reasons.
Correct.
But now we can infer that says, hey, grandma is not out by 9:30. Perhaps you may want to check in with her. And that's what we'll do.
Okay, so that's why you're known as a silent system, right?
That's
That's what you
correct.
refer to yourself as, not to yourself, but to your system as. Okay, so what has been the hardest trade-off that you've had to make when it comes to a technical standpoint?
From a technical perspective, obviously there are two ways to do detection, right? It's either on device, what we call it on the edge, on device, or on the cloud. So we run analytics on the cloud right now, and there's sufficient cost involved on an ongoing basis, but we didn't have a choice. To run it on a camera, it requires a purpose-built hardware with high computing power, processors, and that itself is very costly. So we'd rather choose a lower upfront cost that is a little bit more palatable, even though it means a higher ongoing cloud cost for us and for its users. So that is the current approach that we're looking at right now. Ideally, we can reduce both costs and give you the same kind of output in that sense. But as of now, there are technical constraints, meaning I can't have the best of both worlds. So I'd rather choose lower upfront with a monthly fees that will be a bit more palatable for most users rather than a few $100s for one camera just to monitor an elderly.
Yeah, no, that makes, and I guess in time with more and more technology coming in, I think you will be able to change that.
Definitely.
We all are aware that we look at Singapore, or there are a number of other countries where societies are aging rapidly. So, what do you think are we getting wrong about how we support care at home?
I think when an elderly first, okay, usually they will come up from an institutional care or a clinical care in a hospital of sorts, right? So when you move from that setting, a professional setting, to a home setting, I think the biggest difference that most people experience is that in the professional setting, as the word suggests, everyone is a professional. They're experiencing what they do, they have been professionally trained, they know how to lift a person up from the bed, they know how to sit them down, they know what signs, what to look out for in terms of their behaviors, etc. But as caregivers at home, most of the time, family members have been parachuted into that role. It's something that we don't, it's not like school. We don't prepare ourselves to be
Yeah.
caregivers. But unfortunately, at some point in time, some of us, unfortunately, will have to take on this role. So if you think about it, training to be a caregiver is literally what we call an on-job training. Something happens at home, now you become a caregiver, now you start to learn how to do it. You watch the nurses, you practice a few steps, you try to remember it, you repeat it, and then you just try not to hurt yourself or the person you're caring for in a process. And the biggest gap that I see is that people, especially those who are not doing the caregiving, somehow expect families to perform clinical level care without that clinical level training. So there's
Yeah.
this kind of a mismatch of perception of what the person should be and what he really is capable of.
Yeah, and I think so. You're absolutely right that clinical is one aspect. And as you mentioned, professionals who trained to be nurses or okay at the hospital, for them it's clinical, it's not emotional.
Yes, it is.
Whereas when it's a family member who is a caregiver and who suddenly has to become a caregiver, not because it's being forced on them, but because it is something that they would want to do. They are not trained to do it. So for them, it's probably really confusing because there are certain aspects they don't understand. And I guess, which is where, as your system is installed, it helps them at least navigate through and alert them when there are situations that they probably would not know how to handle. So at least if it's alerted to them, they can very quickly call emergency or whatever it is. And so I think you're like the first step into helping.
Absolutely. And if you look at I call it the environment that we're in today, Singapore is unique because we are a small city state, right? East to west is 40 over kilometers. We're like a 30 minutes grab right away. It's clear that there's possibility for us, so that's simple. But if you look at even our neighboring countries like Malaysia, for example, even within KL itself, you have the kids working in the city, which is where everyone aspires to be, and then you may have the parents in the suburbs, for example, and that suburb could be 2 hours away if you need to rush down. So end of the day, by how do you monitor every child wants the best for their parents? So how, but you cannot be at both places at the same time.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? So that's where Ello comes in, where we hope to be able to monitor on your behalf. So as children, we can now also watch over our parents, for example, using it as a regular camera, so we can go in and look at the live stream as per norm. But on events, again, so on events, what you want to be able to do is that when something happens, you are informed almost real time.
Yeah.
Then you can make those calls, right? Ambulance, for example, or even if there is you have a strong neighborhood community, you could even call your neighbors and say, hey, I saw that my dad has fallen down. Could you just pop by and have a look at him, check him out immediately? Because ambulance could take anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes depending on traffic, but your neighbors could be just next door.
Next
So
door.
they can make different decisions, but now you have full clarity of what's happening.
Yeah, they can see what's happening. It's not just an alert. Yeah, no, I get that. You mentioned Malaysia, so I'm assuming that you are now not just in Singapore, but you also have extended low care to other parts of the region.
We
Am I
are
right?
Singapore. We are starting in Singapore because we are a Singapore-based company,
Yeah.
and it's much easier for us to offer any technical support, any requirements in that sense, and to respond better and faster. But interestingly, why Malaysia has also become an area of interest, which we'll be pursuing immediately after Singapore, is that not too long ago, actually, I was invited for an interview with Business FM 89.9, I think, a Malaysia business station, because they also felt the producers felt that what Ello was offering was something really close to his heart. So that story that I shared earlier on about working in the city and the family is not with him, that was his story. Actually, it was a real situation whereby that physical distance doesn't allow that caregiving to be done the way he would have loved to be beside his mom, for example, or his grandma, for example. But he's got to work, he's got career on the line, right? So how do you balance that? And to him, he wanted to know more about Aloy. He felt that, hey, there's so much use cases over here in Malaysia. And I can imagine that even JB itself is not near, if you think about it. And what about Singaporeans working in Malaysia or Malaysians working in Singapore? How do you balance that? How do you monitor your parents, for instance? And that's where we realized actually Allo and the solutions that we're building actually has this sort of demand that is in the market that we don't see it right now, or it's not addressed the way it should have been.
Is there anyone else doing what you're doing in another part of the world?
We have seen other solutions in the market. Typically, when it comes to elderly care solutions, there are what we call the more intrusive ones like ours because we use cameras, and then the not so intrusive ones that uses sensors, for example, or buttons, for example. So there are pros and cons of each of them. The way I
Yeah.
look at it is that sensors are great, but they don't give you full clarity because everything is not, it's not a picture, it's not a video, it's blobs, shapes, and then the AI sort of understands what that shape means and oh, it's a fall, and then you know it's a fall, right? Buttons, we have spoken to many caregivers and understand that their parents hate putting on lanyards with buttons, for example. They don't like wearing wearables because the moment they take it out to charge, they probably forget to put it back on again. So again, it's not on the body, right? So all these devices don't really help. Now, for me, we like to think we're unique in a sense because I have not seen any solution that's really identical to ours. Yes, there are cameras in the market that detects false. That's about it. But to us, when it comes to elderly care, there's so many permutations, like we mentioned. It could be smoke and fire. It could be an elderly just wandering out of the house and not returning back. It could be falls and faints. And then again, and then we are also doing routine monitoring. So I mentioned if grandma is not out by 9:30, we will prompt. Same for toilets. We don't have cameras in the toilets, but we can monitor the doors that leads to the toilet and say, hey, 15 minutes, grandma is out. I think you better check in on her. But beyond that, you see, because we have all this information that's of what's going on, we want to start building certain insights and analytics of the elderly themselves. So, Payal, for example, if my grandma, okay, she's not around anymore, but for example, my grandma has been sitting on the couch for too long. I now know that grandma has been sitting on the couch for the last 2 hours. I can prompt the caregiver, it could be the family, it could be a professional one, and nudge the caregiver, hey, reach out to grandma, ask her to encourage her to walk around, encourage her to get a drink, for example. Don't stay seated on the couch. So we are doing a lot more holistic monitoring versus just pure camera or buttons and sensors in that sense. So I don't think I've seen anyone else offering solutions like what we are doing. And probably that's the reason why the feedback, we're not in market yet, but the feedback that we have from caregivers when we share with them what we're working towards has been tremendous. I mean, it's been so encouraging for us.
So when are you likely to be launching officially and being in the market?
The beta units we are expecting to be in market by March, April timeframe this year. And then
Okay.
once we go to market, we will just make sure everything is okay, and then we can move on to commercial readiness immediately thereafter.
Okay, so the pilot is likely to happen in March or April.
That's
That's
correct.
so exciting because I think it's something, one, it's unique. Two, it's so close to your heart. Three is you've done clearly a lot of research with so many conversations with multiple caregivers. I know it's a small market, but it is an aging society. So the fact that you've stepped in, and this is also a way in which you're trying to make a difference. And I think it's going to be a success for sure. And given the way you have described the system, I think it hits the right tone of what it is trying to do and what it's trying to achieve. Ivan, I think it's incredible what you've decided to give back when it comes to elder care and to caregivers. I just wanted to just get a little, as we wrap up, all the caregivers who may be listening or will be listening to this conversation who are feeling very unseen, they're feeling extremely exhausted. What is the one message that you would want for them to hear from you?
It's interesting because I do have my own podcast when I interview caregivers as well.
Oh, really? What's the
And
name of your podcast?
I call it Voices of Care.
Voices of Care. Okay.
And what we do is we focus on sharing caregiver stories in that sense. Nothing to do with Ello. It's really understanding their journey and so that other caregivers can get inspired. And why I say it's interesting because this question is always the same question I ask them at the end of each podcast, right? But so my version of the answer really is to all the caregivers, you're doing a great job. you've been giving so much, but don't forget to love yourself. It's important to keep a cup full, then you can pour from a full cup, right? And remember, there is always help available. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't take it upon yourself. Be brave enough. And I will quote and unquote a very kind gentleman in the last podcast that I did. He shared one very interesting phrase with me is that caregivers, you need to learn to be vulnerable because only then you will know how to open up yourself and ask for the help that you need, that you deserve, because you can't do it alone. And caregiving is a marathon, it's not a sprint, right? So remember, keep a cup full, don't be afraid to ask for help, and love yourself more.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have to, if you have to help someone, then you also need someone to be able to help you in order for you to be able to help the person that needs the help even better. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's interesting. I had no idea that you had a podcast, and it just so aligns with what you are trying to do with the new system that you're developing. And are there a lot of caregivers, and now I'm interested in this, a lot of caregivers in Singapore? That's one. And two, what kind of facilitation is there for them to, is there like some kind of a body that trains them if they approach the family caregivers, if they approach any kind of institution or body or whatever it may be, to help them understand and be able to deal with caregiving in a better way?
Well, I would say that there are two kinds of caregivers in Singapore in that sense. Obviously, one will be the family members who naturally gets again parachuted into this role when something happens to their family members. We do have agencies here in Singapore that are able to that offers courses, for example, to train, to teach them how to become better caregivers, both let's say physically. So again, we've got a chiropractor who is also a caregiver, and he actively shares his knowledge with the industry, whereby as a caregiver, how do you minimize hurting yourself in the process of lifting somebody up from the bed, for example, as simple as count together out loud. Okay, one, two, three, and we go. So it's as simple as sharing those tips for caregivers. So that's the sort of, you can probably search them on some of the podcast videos available. And again, there are institutions who do teach. Of course, there are the other group of caregivers, which are the professional caregivers in the market. So professional caregivers, they usually come from different countries, and they are usually trained in that sense before they approach Singapore. And then again, back to Singapore, they have to go through different tests again to make sure
So
that they A1.
they're not clinically trained.
They're not clinically trained, correct.
Okay.
They are,
Okay.
but they are in a way trained to execute caregiving duties for the elderly, for example. So they know how to take care of elderly, they know how to watch out for their medication, how they're behaving, but they're not nurses in that sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ivan. I really, again, I'm saying I appreciate what you're doing. And now, even more so, that you have a podcast where you talk to caregivers. I think it's so meaningful. And I really appreciate what you're doing. And I've really appreciated this conversation with you as well. So, thank you for being a part of my show. And I'm sure the message that we will be able to convey to people at the end of, whoever's listening eventually listens to the conversation when it's published, is to have that. I think what I have picked up from what you've said, especially about caregivers, is to take care of themselves first so that they're able to take care of the vulnerable. And I think that is a very important message. So, once again, thank you so much, Ivan, for being a part of the show.
Thank you, Payal, for having me. I'm glad that you found this session insightful, and I hope that caregivers out there get the kind of recognition that they deserve and the kind of support that they need.